So we're going to go ahead and start our webinar today on the question of land use and indigenous land rights in the Grand Canyon. But before we begin, I would like to read the land acknowledgement statement. The Latin American Institute at UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva people as the traditional land caretakers of the Tovangar, which is the Los Angeles Basin and the Southern Channel Islands. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the ancestors, the elders, and our relatives, past, present, and emerging. So our event today has been organized as a result of a collaboration between the Latin American Institute and the Institut des Amériques in Paris. UCLA is one of several pôles californiens, or California hubs of the Institute, American hubs of the Institute, and we are the one in California. And every few years, the Institut des Amériques sends a researcher here to supervise their activities in Los Angeles and in this part of the United States. That person, for the last couple of years, we've had the pleasure of hosting Eugénie Clément, who is a doctoral candidate in anthropology at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. Eugénie does, well, I'll let her tell you about her own work on the Navajo Nation and in organizing this panel. Eugénie, go ahead and take it away and get us started today.
All right. Thank you very much, Brian. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Thanks for joining us today on Monday. First, I would like to thank the different departments and institutions sponsoring this event. So the Latin American Institute, hosting me as a visiting student, the American Indian Studies Center, the Department of Anthropology, and the Institut des Amériques. And a special thanks to you, Brian, for always trusting me in the different event I'm proposing. And to Ariane Pereira, who is always making the flyers and responsible for the technical aspect. So UCLA sits on, as you said, Gabrielino Tongva land, and Los Angeles was built on indigenous lands. It is of utter importance to acknowledge this, but at the same time, one can wonder if land acknowledgement by university and institutions has not become another symbolic rhetoric. And to quote my dear friend, Bettina Escauriza, filmmaker, journalist, and artist, land acknowledgements have become very popular, almost a prerequisite, and thus have come to feel like an empty ritual, especially when given by powerful institutions who are in a position to actually engage in the material process of giving land back and making way for greater autonomy for indigenous communities. This place you find yourself in at this moment has a history, and the way in which we engage with the complexity of said histories plays a critical role in how we shape our collective futures. I like to think of land acknowledgements as an opportunity to engage the notions of what is possible and to grapple with the reality that poverty, war, gender-based violence, race-based violence, unequal development, lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to education, and all the forms of oppression are product of human will and not the fault of immutable natural laws nor mysterious spiritual phenomenon. All of this to say that we build the world that we live in, and perhaps a land acknowledgement is a moment that can offer us a kind of reflection that leads us into action, as opposed to superficially soothing, misplaced, paralyzing guilt that amounts to business as usual for everyone involved. So with that being said, the links to our panel today seem pretty evident. Today we will look at the relationship between public lands, indigenous sovereignties, and the conservation of these territories. The construction of America as a nation stands on the idea of endless land available for everyone. Land can be analyzed as an utilitarian object in the settler colonial ideology, with a dualist approach of nature versus culture, reflecting a Western hegemonic discourse separating subjective right and object. According to that ideology, land is an object of profit, emphasizing the manifest destiny. The construction of territories as a wilderness allow a settler government to use a discovery doctrine. Nobody was here, nobody uses the land, or at least nobody uses it properly, that is through a rational management beneficial for a capitalist economy. So despite this, their seemingly unproductive use, public lands, national parks are tied to that history. In 1903, President Roosevelt designated the Grand Canyon a national monument. And in 1919, President Woodrow Wilson made the Grand Canyon a national park to, I quote, protect the land and the resources within it. But one can ask, to protect it from who and what? Under what political condition are certain lands being designated as public and labeled wilderness? And I would like to speak of the example of the Yosemite National Park in Northern California as a great example. So it is the traditional homeland of the Awa-Nechi. I'm very sorry if I pronounce that badly. So gold rush resulted in the invasion of their homeland, and the designation of the Yosemite as a national park in 1890 further restricted them using the land, and in 1975, they were simply banished from it. So the construction of public park as natural treasures available for everyone erases thousands of years of interaction of Indigenous nations and tribes with this land and the crucial importance of Indigenous nations in shaping them. So this webinar seeks to explore the current perception and condition of use of public land and outdoor recreation with an emphasis on the Grand Canyon. Who has access to the land? Who gets to enjoy it? And what use, connection, or lack of them does it reflect? There is an economic, social, and cultural approach to public land uses. So to gain insight of this very necessary conversation, we will have 4 interventions today. So Julia Vogel, anthropologist, Cody Fetty, Diné and Program Coordinator at Ancestral and Conservation Corp, Colin Cooley, Diné advocate and raft guide on the San Juan River, and finally, Deidre Peaches, filmmaker, director, editor, and writer. So after this 4 intervention, we will watch Deidre's latest documentary, Voices of the Grand Canyon, and then we will have time for question with the audience. So with no further ado, let me introduce Julia Vogel, our first panelist. So she received her PhD in cultural anthropology from French University Paris-Nanterre, and she spent a couple of years in Northern Arizona during 2015 and 2018 to carry a study about Grand Canyon National Park's past and present, from the historic construct of wilderness that led to the removal of Native American tribes to how Native American voices appear in the national park today. So our research takes a closer look at the shifting power relation shaping the national park and the perception of nature and culture to rebuild. So the floor is yours, Julia.
Hi, well, thank you, Eugénie. I'm glad to be here today. My throat hurts a little, so I'm sorry if sometimes I'll have to do this adorable sound. So I look forward to hearing the other speakers, so Cody, Colleen, and Deidre address this very interesting question, which we're here to discuss. How does our relationship to the land change when the land is being protected by Indigenous conservationists? At least that's the question I saw on the flyer. And on my end, I won't so much offer an answer to this question directly, but rather I would like to start off this conversation by suggesting we take a little step back and ask ourselves, why is this question being raised in the first place today, and why is it important? So for a few minutes, let's turn our attention towards some concepts like nature, culture, and wilderness that may seem obvious, but actually that are everything but obvious. And I'd like to describe how these concepts are highly political tools. So on the whole, my goal is to offer some thoughts about the political aspects of conservation through Grand Canyon National Park's history. And my hope is that my presentation is not going to be too dense, because it's really very much going to be focused on concepts and word meanings. In our everyday lives, we hear the words nature and wilderness so often that they seem to describe this obvious reality that is out there for us to observe, to use, to visit, or to protect, as if we were separate from it. So to put it in a nutshell, in Western thought, nature is what is out there, while we human beings stand outside of it like observers and we observe it from our cultural lenses, because we have and we are culture or society. So there would be one nature that is objective, that has its own rules, and scientists are the people who have the proper tools to understand those rules. And then there is society that is divided into several cultures that have different cultural perception of this one nature. So what I'm describing here is a way of understanding the world that is not universal, and it's a very Western paradigm. It's not the only Western paradigm, but it's a very Western paradigm. And the whole idea of national parks rests on this divide between the realms of nature and culture. As French anthropologist Philippe Descola puts it, in order to consider protecting nature, first you need to believe that nature exists as an outside reality, as an autonomous non-human realm. And it is because we consider ourselves like standing outside of the natural that we can threaten it, destroy it, or protect it. And similarly, the whole idea of protecting nature through setting it aside, through fencing it off, through allowing only limited use, and by considering that the proper place for humans is only as visitors who don't remain, all those rules and regulations we rely on to manage and protect what we call nature are based on the concept of a non-human nature on which humans, as outside entities, can have a detrimental or positive influence. But this idea of nature is actually far from being natural. It's been historically and culturally constructed. And most importantly, it implies power relationships, because it leads to the next question, which is, who is to decide what is a detrimental and what is a positive influence on nature? But before we get to that question, I'd like to take a very brief look at the historical construction of notions such as nature and wilderness. The concept of nature hasn't always existed, and it doesn't exist in every part of the world. That's what anthropology teaches us. And we can identify the first traces of the idea of nature in ancient Greece. Its meaning has changed a lot over the course of centuries. And we've gone a long way from the medieval European representations of nature, where as nature being God's creation and humanity being a part of it, to the more secular and rational idea of nature that has prevailed in Europe after the Renaissance, and that still prevails today in Europe and the United States. And similarly, the concept of wilderness isn't universal, and its definition has changed a lot. We commonly define wilderness as a pristine sanctuary of untouched nature. As William Cronon writes, wilderness is, and I'm quoting, far from being the one place on earth that stands apart from humanity. And on the contrary, it is quite profoundly a human creation. And wilderness is a human creation for several reasons. First, it actually never existed out there. And we'll get back to that in a few minutes because that's very important. And secondly, our appreciation for what we call wilderness is cultural. Before wilderness became so precious that it needed our protection, it was considered by the European pioneers like a worthless wasteland, and it was a scary, worthless wasteland. As Roderick Nash explains in his famous book, Wilderness and the American Mind, I'm quoting, wild country had value as potential civilization. So by itself, wild country had no value. It had to be tamed, it had to be turned into a garden. And so in his book, he explains how the conquest of wilderness was the pioneers' major concern. And wild lands needed to be tamed to become useful, so that the worthless land became useful. the perception of wilderness as something valuable and sublime began to grow in the cities during the 18th and 19th century, so way later. And the wilderness was the same, right? What changed was the people's attitudes towards it. By the mid-19th century, wilderness had become the symbol of American identity. So to put it in a nutshell, compared to Europe, the American continent had something unique and valuable, and that was wilderness. One important factor in the development of an appreciation for wilderness was Turner's frontier thesis. So I'm sorry for those who already know all of this, but I think it's important to come back to a bit of this historical data to understand what's happening today. So back to Turner's frontier thesis. According to Turner, the identity and the success of the United States was directly associated with the pioneers' contact with wilderness during the westward expansion. And by the turn of the 20th century, wilderness was not an enemy to conquer anymore, as I have described earlier, but it became this beneficial influence on people and institutions. So when Turner announced the ending of the frontier at the end of the 19th century, in the last decade of the 19th century, that prompted many Americans, including Theodore Roosevelt, to find ways to protect portions of this American wilderness. And that is when the idea of creating nature preserves gained momentum in the United States. So obviously, I'm taking a lot of shortcuts here. But mainly I wanted to show how we went from this very negative perception of wilderness as something useless that had to be changed to something valuable that needed protection. And I think the history of Grand Canyon National Park serves as a very good example of the changing attitudes and appreciation of what we call wilderness. The first European American to produce a detailed and widely read report of the Grand Canyon is Lieutenant Joseph Christmas Ives. And he wrote a report, well, he started his expedition in Grand Canyon in 1857. He was then sent by the government to investigate the region. And in his report, he concludes by stating that the Grand Canyon region had no potential for future settlement. He called it valueless because it was inhabitable, and he described it literally, his words, as a profitless locality. And we all know that history proved him wrong. So Grand Canyon was a profitless locality, but then the arrival of the railroad in the late 1880s made the West viable for ranching and logging. And more prospectors started roaming the canyon and settling in the South Rim. So famous prospectors such as Hans, Bass, Tanner, all these famous names, these people used trails that had previously been used by Native American tribes, and they restored them. And those trails actually are now named after these prospectors. And many of them came to Grand Canyon to discover and extract its resources, but they ended up finding the tourist industry to be more profitable. So they started offering guided tours and set up tent camps and hotels. They provided basically the first visitor services at the canyon. So for those who know a bit of Grand Canyon history, by the time these prospectors came, there had been more explorations of the Grand Canyon, including the one of Major Powell, which is I guess one of the most famous names of the European American history of Grand Canyon. And he had advertised the Grand Canyon as a geologic wonder, so many people were rushing over to discover it. So by the end of the 19th century, logging, mining, and ranching were the dominant activities on the landscape, and concern was slowly escalating over the destruction of the natural resources of the West. and unregulated tourism was also pointed out as being potentially detrimental to the place. That's when different actions were taken to protect what had become a natural wonder. So the first measure, the first protection measure, saying a very French thing right now. Well, anyways, President Harrison created a forest reserve, and that was the first legislation to try to protect the place. And then, as Eugénie said earlier, in 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt visited the canyon and gave his famous speech that goes, "Leave it as it is. You know, you cannot improve on it. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it." So he designated a national monument in 1908. And finally, in 1919, Grand Canyon became a national park. And back in the day, and to this day, the creation of Grand Canyon National Park was viewed as a victory in this effort to preserve nature from destruction. And the governing ideologies behind the creation of, well, this national park, but any national parks, were so powerful that most people actually accepted this idea that the landscapes that were chosen for protection were in fact natural and pristine and free from human impact. And that's an idea that is still very popular today, at least in the world, and I think even in the United States. And so right now I'd like to stress too that we're getting to what I think is the important part of what I'm trying to say. And these are two related thoughts. First, the first thought that I'd like to share is about how this pristine nature free from human impacts and protected by natural parks actually never existed in the first place. And second, I would like to stress how once this concept of wilderness basically was created, it functions both intentionally and unintentionally as a political instrument of social power. So as I said a minute ago, for decades and to this day, the creation of national parks such as Grand Canyon was viewed as a victory, in the effort to preserve nature. And this narrative has only started changing recently. So the environmental historians were the first scholars to rethink the history of national parks. And I'm saying scholars, because a lot of other people had mentioned it. But basically, since the 1990s, these scholars started showing how the preservation of nature and the dispossession of native tribes went hand in hand. And that started raising awareness to the fact that the widespread idea that national parks preserve the remnants of a non-human nature actually erases the fact that native people had shaped these environments for millennia. And not only it erases the history of prior land occupation, but wilderness in national parks was actually created by the very displacement and dispossession of native tribes. And there's this quote that I'm actually going to show you from one of these historians, Mark David Spence. So I'm going to share my screen. It's just a few lines, but I think some people have more of a visual memory, so it'll be easier. So in his book, he writes that the fact that Indians continued to hunt and light purposeful fires in such places seemed only to demonstrate a marked inability to appreciate natural beauty. So to guard against these violations, the establishment of the first national parks necessarily entailed the exclusion or removal of native peoples. And I think this quote shows two very important things. First, it shows how once this idealized, untouched nature was created, Native peoples had to be excluded from national parks in order to keep it, well, to keep them, the national parks, safe and untouched. And that's very important because this is how concepts such as nature and wilderness are instruments of political and social power. Because basically, sorry, my computer was talking to me. Basically, these places are created as natural, so it becomes natural and not political to exclude human beings from these places because it's done in the name of nature and not in the name of social constructions of nature. I hope I'm being clear. And the second thing that this quote shows is that there are multiple representations about what is proper use of a place and what activities are appropriate. And the fact of eliminating or at least hiding all traces of human presence in what we call nature, like considering that lighting fires or hunting are detrimental, that is only one approach to conservation, or at least one approach to how we should properly relate to nature is what I should actually say. And it is far from being universal, as the other speakers will show today later better than I will. So when talking about conservation, I think it's really important to keep in mind the fact that we're talking about whose knowledge is being taken into account. Wait, I can stop this. Yes. Yeah, it's important to, so I'm just going to repeat myself. It's important to keep in mind the fact that, yeah, we're talking about whose knowledge is going to be legitimate and whose knowledge is not. And I'll leave you with one last thought that I'm borrowing from Portuguese Brazilian anthropologist Manuela Carneiro da Cunha, which I found very eye-opening when I discovered it. And it's like a thought about words and their implications. So that'll be my last, my last comment about concepts and words. So Manuela Carneiro da Cunha highlights the fact that when we use the word knowledge by itself, what we're implying is a certain kind of knowledge, and it's scientific knowledge. And when we talk about anything other than scientific knowledge, then we need to add other adjectives like traditional knowledge or cultural knowledge. And I think this is really important to notice because it implies that scientific knowledge is the universal reference knowledge and that other kinds of knowledge are only partial. And that's all related. I hope you can see the links that I'm trying to make. Because that again shows the power relationships that are implied in conservation when you consider that scientific knowledge, which we basically only call knowledge, is the proper way to manage a place. And then other knowledges, cultural, traditional, are just this cultural view on nature. They're cultural perspectives, but nature has its own natural rules, which scientists can discover, and all this is very common. This is how we when I say we, I'm actually talking about Western paradigm. I shouldn't say we, but this is it. I mean, this is how national parks are managed, and not only national parks. This is how it's written in the way the whole political system works in the United States and in many parts of the world, in Europe as well. And I think it's really interesting to important to maybe start or stop thinking about conservation without taking into account the power relationships that it rests on. And today in Grand Canyon National Park, there are 11 tribes that have received official recognition of their prior occupation of the lands. And the National Park Service recognizes that these tribes call the Grand Canyon home, that they have a history there, and that their connection to the place is very much alive to this day. And on this thought, I'll leave the other speakers say more about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very necessary framework in order to understand this conversation. We will now go with Colleen Cooley. So Colleen grew up wandering the washes, mesas, and sandstones in Shanto, a small community located on the Navajo Nation in northeast Arizona. Her curious mind and innate connection to the lands and waters led her to earning a master's degree in climate science and solution from Northern Arizona University in 2012. Colleen is passionate about the protection and conservation of the diverse landscapes, culture, and waters that she is surrounded by because it is part of who she is and where she comes from. She's an advocate and raft guide on the San Juan River and Green River, a community organizer, a skilled facilitator, a volunteer with Navajo Yes, a board member with the Flagstaff Mountain Film Festival, and a Running with Purpose athlete advocate. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just want to say hehet to Eugenie and Brian and the University of California, LA for hosting this webinar. And I know Cody was supposed to go after Julia, but I thought my presentation fits well after what Julia just presented here. So I'm going to show a PowerPoint. I think I'm the only one that has a PowerPoint here. Let's see. Can you all see that okay?
Yeah, we can see it perfectly.
Okay, great. Well. All right. So the title of this webinar is called Public Lands, quote unquote, National Parks and Landback, a conversation about Indigenous sovereignties and land conservation. So first, I want to introduce myself in my Navajo language. Shant Twohodant do Bistog Ejendeshkis Dant Nasha, Akut Au A Diné Astonishment. And I just mentioned my 4 clans. I am Towering House, born for the Reed People clan, and my paternal grandfather's clan is Many Goats clan, and then my maternal grandfather is Water That Flows Together clan. And thank you, Eugenie, for that introduction. And just a little bit more about who I am. I think Eugenie mentioned some of it, so I just wanted to share some photos with you all. Actually, I'm headed out for a raft trip this coming weekend, so I'm looking forward to that on the San Juan River. I'm also a runner and a volunteer with Navajo Yes and the Flagstaff Mountain Film Festival, an educator, facilitator, and I just started my own business around facilitation. And most importantly, I am Diné. And this is, one picture of the landscape of where I grew up in. And I spent a lot of my childhood here as my parents and my grandparents grew corn down here in the Shanto Wash. And this was taken probably about a year ago after one of my trail runs out there. So it's, there's still some water flowing through there, but definitely with the drought and climate change, it's decreasing in the last 10, 20 years since I spent my time down there as a young child. So before we get started into talking a little bit about, public lands and the national parks, I wanted to ask you all if you want to share in the chat box, what is your relationship with the Grand Canyon? Because we're speaking about, a lot of us are going to be speaking about that today. And then hopefully if you're still on later, you'll get to see a film that was made by Deidre Peaches. And so I'm going to take a few moments if anybody wants to respond, or what is the first thing that comes to mind when you think of the Grand Canyon, if you've never been there? If anybody wants to share, that'd be great.
And if you have any comments on that, you can just put it in the chat.
Yes. Anyone? I know that
you can share it in the comments.
I mean, I think Julia spoke a little bit about it, right? It's one of the 7 wonders of the world. A lot of visitors come through the Grand Canyon. You know, most notably, the narrative right now, a lot of people know about John Wesley Powell and his exploration. You know, he was supposedly the first explorer of the Grand Canyon, but, you know, that's not true. And you'll definitely see a neat video and film that Deidre put together that, you know, highlights the tribal voices, indigenous perspectives. So, okay, well, if you want to share, feel free to share, but all right. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing. So, yep, there's, you know, the Grand Canyon is threatened by uranium mining. Thank you, Ed. Awesome. Well, thank you. So these are 2 maps I wanted to share with you all. These are maps that were created by Stephanie Smith with the Grand Canyon Trust. So we're talking about land conservation, land back, land acknowledgement. And so you can definitely see a big difference here, right? You know, the traditional territories of the Grand Canyon, greater Grand Canyon region was definitely home to a number of tribes. And these are just a few of the tribes mentioned. This doesn't encompass all the tribes. I think there's a disclaimer underneath the map on the left-hand side that states that. Also, so now we're present day Grand Canyon National Park. You know, it was established in 1919, as Julia mentioned. And these are, you can see how much the land mass has definitely reduced. And there are a lot of other tribes that are included now on this map on the right than the left side. So just wanted to show a visual here. So Julia also mentioned, you know, some of the narrative is changing, and I just want to talk a little bit about how that is changing, you know, through media or through groups like the Intertribal Centennial Conversations group. And I've been part of that since the beginning, which began in 2018. And so credit goes, let's see, what was I going to say here? So this is Colleen Koska. She's one of the original members of this group that was interested in sharing their ideas and perspectives on how the Grand Canyon National Park and its partners could improve the relationships with tribes within and around the Grand Canyon because of the centennial back in 2019, because they were celebrating their 100 years that they've been in existence, right? But these tribal members were saying, no, the Grand Canyon, we've been here way long before the existence of the park. And there's a history there. We want you all to acknowledge that. And then let's see how we can move forward together. And so this is one of the, you can find this if you just type in this title, you can Google it and find a few more perspectives that are listed in that story. Just another example of Outside Online magazine, covering also other tribal perspectives and how, you know, our homelands are not playgrounds. You know, there's There's the Grand Canyon National Park. There's, Devil's Tower, or Devil's Tower as it's called today. But there's definitely a history there, right? There's the connection to the tribal members that live in that area and that visit these places for ceremony or for gathering medicinal plants and stuff like that. So this was another one I wanted to share. And within here, it kind of describes a few tribes and their connections to their sacred areas. And this one talks about the Grand Canyon again, and the Havasupai and their connection to a place known as Beaver Falls here. And so this one was kind of interesting to read through because the Havasupai, they have a fee for having visitors come to their homelands. And for some reason, it looks like some private river runners maybe, or hikers were not wanting to pay that fee. And so it's like, what I'm trying to get at is that we have our inherent sovereignty rights to, provide permits and fees, and even shut down, as you saw during the COVID pandemic, that the Havasupai even shut down the whole reservation for any visitors to come in. And I'm not sure if they've opened back up yet for people to hike there. But the message here is that these places are really significant and culturally important to the tribes. And so just be mindful and respectful of that. So last week was National Park Week. I don't know if any of you knew that this was happening. I actually did not know that it was happening until I saw this post and other posts about it. People talking about, getting access to the parks for free, or, talking about, volunteer events that are happening with different parks. But again, going back to what is the true history of these national parks, right? There's been displacement of our relatives from the very beginning to establish these parks. But my question was, when this was happening and last week, if any of the parks were providing any education about the true history of how the national parks were created, or if there was any acknowledgement of the original habitats. But I'm not sure, but I know the Bears Ears Coalition, there's another lady that goes by Native Power Rangers on Instagram. You should definitely follow her. And she was giving some information about, what, just as a reminder, like what does this actually mean? Acknowledge the peoples that still live in these places. And also Indigenous Women Hike is also another group to follow, and they definitely provide a lot of resources and education around this. And I know Julia touched on the concepts of wilderness and nature. And so again, there's some information here that might be useful. Oh, that didn't come out good. Oh no. Well, this one was going to talk about public lands. Basically, that's too bad it didn't come out. Basically, essentially public lands is, if you look it up in the online, it states that public land is owned by the federal government, right? But there's a whole history there that of how it came to be. And I won't go too much into detail about it, but basically it was based off of, Manifest Destiny, which led to the colonization and the genocide of Indigenous peoples and our language and our culture, which now is the end result of these lands, public lands, right? National parks, Bureau of Land Management. There's national monuments, there's scenic rivers being designated. There's forested lands, right? The Forest Service manages those lands. But gosh, this did not come out good. And then there's Public Lands Day that was established in 1994. And so I think that's probably started by the National Park Service, basically a day to celebrate and have volunteers come out and restore and improve public lands. But I put a Instagram post up last year, and I didn't know Public Lands Day was a thing either. And so this was what I wrote in my post, you know. Apparently it's Public Lands Day, whatever that means. These lands are Indigenous lands, right? These lands were inhabited by Indigenous peoples before the state, federal, BLM, Forest Service, and private landowners took over. We know this, and we are still here, and we don't need the Western science to prove our inherent existence. And I'm saying that because there's also articles coming out that are saying, oh, Indigenous peoples, or there was proof of us being on these lands from 20,000 years ago. And it's like, well, yeah, duh. We already know this. We don't need science to prove that. And so I think learning whose lands you're on is a good to learn, but also, you know, going beyond land acknowledgement, which I'll get into a little bit here, and supporting, you know, our people and the initiatives happening in your area, and most importantly, visiting these places with respect. And I like this quote here by Robin Wall Kimmerer. So she says, let us acknowledge that what we call public land is also ancestral land, the source of life and well-being for Indigenous peoples who played an integral role in maintaining its ecological vitality, producing not a wilderness, but a cultural landscape, a home. So, I mean, I love, if you don't know her, definitely get to know some of her work and also the books she has written. She has some really neat information to share as well. This is not coming out right. Sorry, guys. I think this next one was talking about land acknowledgement and the definition of land acknowledgement. Which there are many definitions around land acknowledgement if you just Google it. But basically, it's a optional or formal statement that recognizes and respects Native peoples as the traditional stewards of lands. The statement highlights the enduring relationship between Native peoples and their traditional territories. And so at the beginning of this webinar, Brian gave a statement to acknowledge, you know, the Indigenous peoples of the lands that the Institute is on. And some of you may be familiar with this map here, which is the native land map. And you can look up whose lands you're on. But going beyond land acknowledgement, right? It's a great first step for a lot of us as individuals, as institutions, as programs, organizations. But what is the purpose of a land acknowledgement if you're not going to do something that's meaningful? So one of the questions here is, how am I leaving Indigenous people in a stronger, empowered place because of this land acknowledgement, right? Just kind of thinking about that possibly before doing a land acknowledgement, but also after you give a land acknowledgement. And so I want to credit the Native Governance Center here. They have great resources online about land acknowledgement, thinking about questions to ask yourself, self-reflection before doing a land acknowledgement. And I won't go into detail here. You guys can read this on your own. But I just want to give an example. I'm on the board for the Flagstaff Mountain Film Festival. And we had talked about doing a land acknowledgement during the film festival, which happened about 2 weeks ago here in Flagstaff. And I kind of had a conversation with the board, and I said, what is the purpose? What is our purpose of doing a land acknowledgement? I want it to be more meaningful. I want to have us as a board to take action or get more Indigenous peoples involved or have more initiatives and have a purpose for this land acknowledgement, not just doing it because it's performative, because a lot of institutions and other groups are still doing this, right? And so we decided not to do it for this year's film festival. And so hopefully we can talk through some of those questions for ourselves and possibly do it for next year. And also I think land acknowledgement, it's helpful if you can ask and develop those relationships with the Indigenous peoples of the lands you're on, not just asking them to come do a land acknowledgement and then forget about, you know, who they are and where they come from after your event. Again, Indigenous Woman Hike has some information on this, doing more than just using that native land app that I showed you earlier, and asking the question, like, what Indigenous organizations or businesses exist on those lands that you can support? Oh my gosh, this is bad. So this one just was a slide about, you know, my advocacy, and I'll go through it here quickly. So I was featured in a film, Water Flows Together, and you can also Google that. So that just gives my perspective of my connection to the San Juan River. I also am advocating for our inclusion of our perspectives in different spaces, such as the film festival, such as Colorado River Days, which is coming up in September. I'm also involved with the Native Teen Guide and Training Program. I'm having conversations with other Native guides. I'm hopefully going to start looking into how to be a San Juan River Keeper under the Waterkeeper Alliance. And then the other one is the Intertribal Centennial Conversations group that I mentioned earlier. And so here's the Native Teen Guide and Training. I wanted to do a little bit more of something besides being part of the week-long trip that was held last year in June, which was my first time being a guide on that trip with the Native Teen Guide and Training Program that Canyonlands Field Institute puts on every year. And that one's going to be coming up again this year. And so I invited 2 participants to talk about their own experience. We want to hear from them themselves, like what they experienced, what they learned, and if they are interested in becoming a guide later on. And I think the people that attended that event were very, I think, surprised to hear just from the teens themselves. And so we're advertising for this year's trip, and you can find that at Googling Native Teen Guide and Training, Canyonlands Field Institute. So if you know any Native teens out there interested in going on the San Juan trip for this year, reach out to me as well. Just some of the films that we showed at the Flagstaff Film Festival, and I curated this session. And because I don't think a lot of folks know or filmmakers know about our festival still, at least the Indigenous folks, the filmmakers, or even Indigenous related films. So I had to find all these films on my own and get them to submit their film. So, and then going back to the the Intertribal Centennial Conversations group, this is one of the initiatives happening currently, is changing the Indian Garden name in the Grand Canyon to be Havasupai Garden. And so that's happening, and because of those conversations we had early on in 2018, 2019. I don't want to get too much into this, but landback, that's another movement that's happening. And basically it's a movement to reclaim Indigenous lands, as well as culture, as well as our language, right? A lot of our language was somewhat lost or forbidden when we were in boarding school and when colonization happened. And so I know that the Indian Collective, look them up, they have a landback campaign. They're really leading the movement. And so all of this information I'm sharing, like this is ongoing work that's happening, and I want to acknowledge those that are already putting in that work. And I'm just sharing some of it here with you today. And so hopefully that's educational for you all. And basically, and they also state that it's the reclamation of everything stolen from the original peoples, but land back does not mean tribal nations want to reclaim their lands and force everyone to leave. That would be genocide. So just keeping that in mind as well. And so there's some success stories, right? Some indigenous peoples are getting some of their land back as well. So this would be one example here. A recent one, actually, I just read about. Oh my gosh. I had some really cool quotes here, but it looks like the formatting did not work out for me. But here's one with the Pueblo Action Alliance. We can't have land back without water back. So, and then some resources and campaigns to follow. I can also share this in the chat in a little bit. I mentioned some of it here. And ways to connect with me. You can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, or on my website. And that's it. Thank you. I hope you learned something new, and really appreciative of my fellow panelists here, and also again to Brian and Eugenie, and for everybody that's tuning in. I know that kind of went by pretty quick for me, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Colleen, for all this information. Do you think, as you mentioned, that you could like share that in the chat? The
yes.
Different like okay, great. Amazing. And we have questions already. I'm seeing them. Okay, I would like to keep them in the end, but they will be answered. Right. Okay. So our next panelist is Cody Fetty. So let me introduce him. So Cody is originally from the lands known for respect existence or expect resistance, the Great Lands of Black Mesa, Big Mountain in Arizona. Cody started their conservation journey with AZZC. Their first corps experience was in 2019 with Ancestral Lands crew working at the Grand Canyon, installing and refurbishing cattle guard fence line. They enjoyed the experience with the Corps network and returned for 3 more seasons. Throughout their work and time spent with AZCC, they also, after that, went to work at the Montana Conservation Corps. And since the beginning of this year, 2022, they are the new program coordinator at Ancestral Land Conservation Corps based in Gallup. So thank you, Cody, and you can unmute yourself and share your work. Thank you very much.
Hello. Hi, everyone. If you lose me, if I lose connection, it's because I'm in the deep res right now, and I'm using my personal hotspot. I was last minute sent out on a project site by my job. So yeah, but the hotspot's been working pretty good. So I'll just start by introducing myself. Yat e she'e ki anishle. Oops. Okay. She'e ki anishle. Bilagana bashashin. Klizatlana dashache na kaidina dashanele. Akwat ego bila sha dina anishle. Zitnitza denisha e kitlana hawan. My name is Cody Fetty. I'm originally from the Black Mesa Big Mountain region. I grew up in Flagstaff, Arizona, and I currently reside in Gallup, New Mexico. As Eugenie said, I am the new program coordinator at the Gallup, New Mexico office, the Navajo office. So just talking about my experience with the Corpse Network. From what Eugenie said, I got into, I guess, land conservation work in the summer of 2019. I really enjoyed my experience working at the Grand Canyon. I learned a lot. I was on a pretty cool, rowdy crew of just like other Native individuals who were looking to learn something new, and who were wanting to work in the Grand Canyon, around the Grand Canyon. So that experience definitely changed, I guess, my life for the better. I then returned for 3 more seasons with Arizona Conservation Corps. I was on multiple chainsaw crews. I was on fencing crews, and just like learned a wealth of knowledge and met some pretty cool people throughout the network. And then I went to go work up in Montana. I led a season. I led a trails and chainsaw crew. And then I just missed the Southwest. And I really wanted to return and work back with my community. And also, I'm in my car, so if you hear that noise, it's my car, so my bad. I wanted to return and work back in my community on the Navajo Nation. So that's why I applied to Ancestral Lands Conservation Corps. And just like a little history of Ancestral Lands Conservation Corps. Ancestral Lands Conservation Corps is pretty new. They were nestled under the programs of Arizona Conservation Corps and Southwest Conservation Corps in Colorado. But now they are their own organization, which is pretty cool. They're able to run 5 offices on different areas of the reservation, not just Navajo Nation. There's 5 offices located in New Mexico and 1 in Arizona. There is the Acoma Pueblo office, which is the OG office that started the AL program back in 2008. There's the Zuni Pueblo office, and then there is the Hopi Kikotsmovi office, and there's the Albuquerque office, and there is the Navajo office, which is the office that I work in Gallup. And we cater to individuals who live around the Gallup area, who identify as Navajo. And Ancestral Lands is a program ran under Conservation Legacy, which is run under AmeriCorps. And AmeriCorps is a program run by the US government. And I think what makes Ancestral Lands very unique is not many people join the program when they're just looking for something to do once they've graduated college and are looking for the Education Siegel Award that is awarded to you after your season, which is used to pay off student debt. But Ancestral Lands, like I said, caters to individuals who live around the region of whatever office you live next to. And we get members who are just looking to really develop their life, who are looking to learn new skills to either bring back to their communities, or who are wanting to go into the Forest Service industry. But we also touch on a lot more other things. We really incorporate traditional ecological knowledge with Ancestral Lands Conservation Corps, whether that be with our trail crews, our chainsaw crews, which focus on fuels reduction work. We have an all native veterans fire crew, which puts veterans back into the workforce. And then we also are hopefully in the future developing a infinity group, which will just be made of queer, non-binary, Native folks. So hopefully that will be in the works soon at Ancestral Lands. And we also touch on interpersonal skills as well, resume building. A lot of topics come up of like food sovereignty and food security as well on the Navajo Nation, because a lot of the times, sadly, crews members who join ALCC say that when they're out in the field, it's like the best meals that they've ever had. So we touch on that as well. But just like the main question that was given to me was the different ideas and goals for conserving lands with all three networks that I worked with. And like I said, Arizona Conservation Corps is set out for any individual. Like, they did have specific programs for people who identify as like Native American, Indigenous. I'm not really too sure about like if those crews are still running. They are definitely still advertised. And then also with Montana Conservation Corps, I know that there is a crew that caters to the Blackfeet Nation. And that's why I think that like AL is significant in that way, is because it's Native run and we hire Native individuals, which is really sweet. Because a lot of the times when you go into this field, it's very white based. You don't really see that many people who look like you if you identify as Native, brown, black, just like a person of color. So we really have that solid connection with the members who roll through Ancestral Lands. And then, like I said, Ancestral Lands is just like the focus for Ancestral Lands when it comes to land conservation is moving past the idea of the terminology and just like the action of like what conservation is. Because if you think of like the history of conservation, it's rooted in racism, it's rooted in sexism. It all goes back to the triple C's. And it's it's so funny because it's the video that they used to show you. I'm not really too sure if they show it anymore at orientations, of like how the Conservation Network started, and it was from during the Depression, and it was putting people back in the workplace, back in the work field. But the triple C's catered to only white individuals, white males. And if you do have a chance to look up the video, it is like just so cringy, because they do go into like detail about like, oh yeah, during the time of the Triple Cs, like there was like segregation. There was Blacks, African Americans who were involved in the Triple Cs, but they were not seen. Oh yeah. The Triple Cs is the ooh, I'm having like a brain fart moment. Hold on.
People texted it. It's Civilian Conservation Corps, right?
Yes, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Yes, thank you. Thank you to whoever put that out there. Dylan, thank you. Yeah, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And like I said, it was only catered to individuals who were white and male, and it was during the time of the Great Depression, so it was putting people back in the workforce. But there was the exclusion of Indigenous people and their voice, and how they were not involved in the conversation of land conservation. And it doesn't really go into much detail about that, but just from like that like small moment in the video, you just like know like what AmeriCorps and conservation legacy used to be. I mean, obviously they have transitioned and have evolved. But at Ancestral Lands, like we do not share that. We don't share that video. We don't talk about that video. We're making our own media coverage of like what conservation, land restoration, traditional ecological knowledge from a Native Indigenous specs looks like. And I think it's different for each office. Just like this past week, our crews went out for chainsaw training, chainsaw certifications, and at the same time, they were helping the Hopi Kikotsmovi office with this pretty sweet project that they've been doing for, I believe, the past 3 years, which is the Firewood Project. I actually worked on the Firewood Project a few years back, and it's just generating firewood for people who live in Hopi because of the shutdown of the Peabody coal mine. So it's really just like transition. It's in that we also implement the transition aspect of like from fossil fuels to other fuels that don't harm our health, that don't harm our community. So we do have like some pretty cool partners who are down to provide some firewood for Hopi families. And that project is really cool. It was really cool to be part of it last week. And then like I said, like Ancestral Lands is just like ever evolving. Like I said, we have just started as our own program. Last year in 2021, Ancestral Lands stemmed off of SCC and AZCC and implemented its own programming on the reservations. So there's definitely more to come in the years for Ancestral Lands Conservation Corps. I know that we are developing our IP programs, which is our individual placement programs for those who are looking for more than just field work. and just like sharing like hunting knowledge and seed gathering knowledge. So definitely look out for ancestral lands in the coming years. And that is it. Thanks.
Thank you, Cody, for sharing this infos. And we will finish with, last but not least, Deidre. So Deidre Peaches is, as I said, Diné filmmaker, director and cinematographer, editor and writer. In 2009, her documentary Shemasani debuted at the Imaginative Film Festival in Toronto, Canada. And so Peaches and Jake Oyungowa, cinematographer, co-founded the independent media company Paper Rocket Production. In 2013, Paper Rocket Production released Do Un Ena at Un, which premiered in Paris, France, for the festival Ciné Alternatif 2012. In 2016, Paper Rocket Production began production of the feature documentary Protect. Protect documents a caravan of Indigenous people and environmental advocates visiting other communities impacted by resource extraction as they travel across the United States to Philadelphia during the 2016 Democratic Convention. In 2020, Peaches documented the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic among the Diné Navajo population in the Southwest. The same year, Peaches founded DLP Production LLC. Recently, Peaches created a series of short documentaries regarding the Grand Canyon and Little Colorado River. Her work are available through the collection The Voices of the Grand Canyon that we're going to watch, and Lifeways of the Little Colorado River. So with no further ado, here you go. Thank you very much, Deidre.
Yate, Shay, Deidre Peaches, Yanishia, Todachini Nishlin, Lokatene, Abashashin, Ashihin Dashache, Todachini Dashanele, Kinflonede Hoyade Nasha. That's me introducing myself, and Dinek Eche, introducing my clans and where I'm from. So yeah, the documentary you're gonna watch is a 12-minute short documentary that illustrates the Indigenous voices that share the home of the Grand Canyon, and their perspectives, their narratives have long been extracted. And when we talk about national parks, when we talk about public lands, there's a series of violence that's been associated with the creation through genocidal tactics, through either through the accessibility of knowledge to in itself. And I think as a native Diné woman, a Diné son, I was told that my gifts aren't just for me, but they're for to share with everyone. And so that's my responsibility. And I think that it's important to understand that as Indigenous Native people, we should start changing kind of like our ways of propelling Western ideals as far as trying to be the best in something, as far as like finding a talent, knowing that a young person is talented with a certain skill and fostering that talent. I think that's something that's inherent to what it is to be Diné, what it is to be Indigenous, is to cultivate. And as we grow plants and as we plant the knowledge, plant those ideas, I think it's important to cultivate it. And so, yeah, I just want to say that to go into questions as far as reparations, as far as like Native people, as far as land back, I think it's important to not put so much dwelling on institutions, as they are the same sort of hierarchy that's implementing the problem that we're encountering as Native people. And so it's important to address, like, okay, if it's a particular nonprofit or of sorts, how much money, where's the money coming from? Where's the money going? How much does the ED make? Like, these are all viable questions, and these sort of institutions propel the same sort of colonial construct that have dismantled Indigenous people from the beginning. So yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge settler colonialism. It's important to associate that there needs to be more recognition in Indigenous voices, and especially Native people who associate as women, Native women voices, and people who don't associate as women. Like I like to think that we're not, in a sense, everyone claims that Diné's a matriarch society, but we're matrilineal. I think that there's a lot of power that's associated to people that are non-binary, people that have different genders that they relate to, and that's important to include in the conversation and not make everything so the dichotomy, the binariness of what Western thought provokes and its ideology. So with that, without further ado, I want to show the documentary.
With my grandparents, and my grandfather took out a cornmeal bag and walked to the rim of the canyon away from where there were other tourists and people, and he stood and he prayed there, and he put cornmeal down. And I asked him, why is that? He said, Lukia, which is Ribbon Falls. We came from there to greet the Sun Father. The Grand Canyon is a place where we emerged from. Chimikanikatea. That's where the Zuni people came from, the Grand Canyon.
The water does not say that I belong to you. The water does not say, you know, I'm going to go this way for these people over here. The water has its own source, its own nature. It does not belong to anybody. It belongs to everybody.
When you say your prayers and you wash yourself with the water source, you're giving yourself very many blessings, as well as letting go of all the negativity that might be building up around.
The Grand Canyon is a monument to the legacy of the Hopi clans. They say that we emerge from the Grand Canyon, a place called Sipaapuni, the trail to the underworld. And then from there we emerge into this present world.
The Grand Canyon and the Little Colorado River corridor has cultural significance. The water that runs into it, those are often viewed as the lifeline of Mother Earth in Kimanahastan.
Grand Canyon National Park is more than a bucket list destination. It is a spiritual home to Native peoples. Our ancestors farmed along the river, built homes in the cliffs, and hunted along the canyon rims since time immemorial. Humans have lived in the Grand Canyon since before the last ice age. Granaries, petroglyphs, and pottery hint at our past, with the oldest artifacts dating back nearly 12,000 years. But rarely do tourists hear firsthand from modern Indigenous people whose cultures, worldviews, and livelihoods are inextricably tied to the Grand Canyon region. Today, at least 11 tribes maintain cultural connections to the Grand Canyon. For some of us, it is a place of emergence. For others, a refuge. For all of us, it is home. These are the voices of the Grand Canyon.
I'm Jim Enote, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Colorado Plateau Foundation. And we are here in Zuni Pueblo lands in what is now New Mexico. So these petroglyphs that we see here, we see many of the same ones in the Grand Canyon. Some of them are clan symbols, some of them are different symbols pertaining to movement and migration, but they are the same ones that we see in the Grand Canyon. So there's evidence of us, actual physical evidence of us being there. And the little Colorado River will continue on by Winslow, and further on it will empty back into the Grand Canyon. So really, the Zuni River and Little Colorado River are like umbilical cords, connecting us back to the place where we emerged. It is a place all the tribes have in common is that they respect that place. Understandably, many people think of the Grand Canyon as a place for recreation of tremendous and important natural history with the beautiful geology and wildlife and scenic views, but it is definitely a cultural landscape.
My name is Lee Gawanwasilma. I'm from the village of Bakawi with the Hopi tribe in Third Mesa. And I was formerly the director of the Hopi Cultural Preservation for 30 years until I retired in 2017. For visitors coming to the Grand Canyon, you see how monumental it is. And it's totally different down below. You just get swallowed by the canyon. And I think it just challenges yourself. My gosh, you know, how could this be? The archaeological sites are our footprints. It is evidence that the Hopi clans traveled through there. The Grand Canyon is very special to us. It's our genesis, and it's also our final spiritual home. We will travel into the spiritual world. And when that happens, our spirit travels to the Grand Canyon, particularly around the area of the confluence. And that is a home for our ancestral people and their spirits. And from the Grand Canyon, the spirits travel throughout the world as clouds.
My parents have always told me about this area when I was growing up in the village of Supai. Well, hello, my name is Colleen Casca. I'm a member of the Havasupai tribe, and the area that we're standing at right now belonged to them, my ancestors. They roamed this whole area, including the Grand Canyon National Park. For this area would be Kasadhe. Nya is the Bright Angel Trail, and then Hakataya, which means the Colorado River, which in translated really means like the big river or a lot of water coming through. My people call the Grand Canyon Wamboajoka, which means where the train stops. The Havasupai people right now reside on a reservation which is 50 miles west of where I'm standing at right now. But this whole area that I'm standing on is Aboriginal territory for the Havasupai people. My people, Havsu Baja, which means people of the blue-green waters. For over 100 years for my people, you know, we've lost a lot of mingling and just coming up here, enjoying the scenery. Once it became a national park, my people were restricted from this area. They were no longer welcomed here. Natives are still around. It's just they've been restricted from the area of their roaming grounds. But they're still in the region, and they will never forget. I will never forget.
My name is Loretta Jackson Kelly. I am a Wallapai tribal member with the Wallapai tribe. Our ancestral homelands, as far as the Wallapai people go, encompassed 7 million acres of northwestern Arizona. The Colorado River is called Hakaama, and the middle of the river is called Hayutata. Our ancestors had always told us the middle of the river is the backbone of the people. And without that backbone, we cannot survive.
Yat she Nikki Cooley Unishia, can you only look at the net a bashichin? As a lana that should nulle, taught headline that should say, bestowed is the skis do, shan't taught that ain't nasha. What I did not as I'm the first Navajo woman to be a commercial river guide for about 13 years. I really was outspoken about my cultural perspectives, and because I felt that the guiding community, but also our clients, they needed to know Native, Indigenous perspectives, and knowledge should always be included in every conversation. The Grand Canyon was always a very sacred, culturally, spiritually significant place to us because of the deities that still live within those boundaries of the Grand Canyon, of the Little Colorado River Corridor, but also the Grand Canyon River Corridor. With the Diné, the big Colorado River is considered the male river, and where the waters come together, the confluence, where the male and female meet. Within those corridors, taught us as Diné people of what it meant to be survivors, and they were also there for the people who were running and trying to hide from the US Army that was trying to hunt them down and take them to Fort Sumner. It's just a very sacred place that we must treat very carefully, respectfully, and not think of it as a theme park.
It's really an honor to be able to go and visit the canyon. Right there at the confluence, I hope we can continue to have tranquility, silence there, because our spiritual people need that as well. So I hope that the visitors will come and also share that kind of feeling that the Grand Canyon and humanity are all one. And that's what I hope the visitors learn.
Well, thank you very much, Deidre, for letting us show you documentary. I would like to, we now have time for question and answers. There's already a bunch of questions. I would like first to ask one question in regard to the landback movement. How or should be public land be given back to Indigenous nation? And from your area of work, what does landback mean? What would it change? Each of you kind of dealt with it, but if you could focus on this, if that resonated with you in any way. Someone wants to answer.
Hello. Yeah, so I think involving the landback movement, that true reparations would be to reinstore true ownership of the land back to Native people. And I think that's something that a lot of white people don't want to have those conversations because of it questions what the benefit has been in their favor as far as instituting laws abiding by this land that's been implemented, that's been stolen from Indigenous people since the inception of it. So I think these are important. And even too, like ownership is a very colonial construct too. Like more restoring is like a relationship that we have with the land, the water, the air, the animals. So it's not just having ownership in terms of colonial constructs, but it's restoring relationships of everything around.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I will then proceed to the question. So Adrian or Erder is asking, who are the native orgs or groups doing work around the Grand Canyon protection? If you could please answer that.
Hello, I guess I'll go. I think going back to just briefly about landback, and I gave some groups that are working on this. Most notable is the, again, Indian Collective Landback Campaign. Google it, look it up. They're doing a lot of great work on that. Crystal Rain Two Bowls is leading that effort. And I liked the way Deidre phrased it. It's not around ownership, it's restoring our relationship with the lands that our ancestors, lived on and cared for since time immemorial. And that was very evident in the film that was shown. And so I know that the Grand Canyon Trust, as well as the Sierra Club, the Grand Canyon Program, Allison Gitlin, are doing some protection of the Grand Canyon region. Those are two organizations that I am aware of and I've done work with. And I don't know if anybody else has other groups that they want to speak to. Those are the two that I know about. And then again, going back to the intertribal centennial conversations, I know with that group, there are different community leaders, tribal members that are involved in different conversations with their tribes or intertribal conversations around how to protect the Grand Canyon, as well as the Little Colorado River.
Okay, thank you. Any other answer from the panelists?
I just wanted to chime in and say that as far as like native-led organizations, there's none that I can think of in the Colorado Plateau region that are led by Native people. As far as the other ones mentioned are usually the white-led kind of like nonprofits. So I think as far as like Native nonprofits or Native sort of groups, coalitions, like there's nothing that really comes to mind.
You wanted to say something, Cody?
Yeah, just to add on to the question of just like land back, there is this article story put out by Yale Environment 360, and it is titled "How Returning Lands to Native Tribes is Helping Protect Nature," and I think it's become a very like talked about topic, and different orgs and also government agencies have, I mean like first and foremost, like excuse my language, but just like fuck like government agencies who really just like have been patrolling and governmenting land because it was like the forced removal of like indigenous people and our right to be there as like original caretakers of the land. But they are like making somewhat progress, especially with this really cool program that's in California. It's called Cultural Burning. It's a woman-led fire crew with the Northern California tribes that are going back to fire knowledge, fire cultural knowledge, and basically saving California because of all the rowdy fires that have happened in the past few years. So really, like when we talk about land back, we really just like can't talk about it. It's definitely just like being about it and like involving Native Indigenous people in those conversations, but also just like going more of like the steps of then just like looking to us as like basic like resources when like Google is out there. There's so much resources out there for everybody who wants to know more about land back. I know like it's a very big wave, and sadly it has become like commercialized. But definitely just like doing your own research of like land back if you are non-indigenous, non-native to these lands is like super important.
Okay, thank you. Bruce Hector is asking us, has anyone from the indigenous movement spoken to Ken Burns, whose film on the national parks only minimally emphasized indigenous people's land use and the destruction or their subsequent use of parks? I have never heard of his documentary. I know Ken Burns, but I haven't heard of this documentary. Have any of you heard of this and this serious problem? So no one?
Well, I've heard of his films, but I don't know that I can answer the question as well, yeah, I'm not sure many indigenous peoples told him about their perception and their history in the land, given that it's barely mentioned. But I think his films are probably a great example of how one paradigm on the nature and the place actually is hegemonic.
Okay, thank you. We also have a question from Paloma. She's asking, is Grand Canyon the original name for the area? If not, should we start calling it by a different name? So I imagine that different tribes and nations have different name. Is in the process of land back, should we not also go back to naming? That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I was going to respond in the chat, but yes, I think that each tribe has their own indigenous name for the place. And that can be indigenous place names. That's a whole nother conversation, right? I think that can be sensitive for some tribes to share with the public. But I know that with land back, I think that is happening with reclaiming the original names. A good example is the, John Muir Trail. I know that Indigenous Women Hike and the efforts they're doing, they are definitely renaming that trail to the original names that they want it to be, because that's one of their ancestral routes that they used a long time ago and probably still use today as well. So yes, I would referred to probably the specific tribes that call the Grand Canyon home. They each have their own specific names.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question from Carrie. Please drop the name of the landback group in the chat and any other names. And I don't really understand what Carrie you mean by the landback group. If you can explain a little bit more. Otherwise, we have a question from, oh, okay. So the landback group that Colleen mentioned, but I think that Colleen already, like with all the resources she mentioned in the chat. Right, Colleen?
I think there's a misconception about landback being just like one particular group. I think that in the sense that it should be pertaining to a movement rather than it being particularly just like one organization. Because when we follow those same sort of institutions that are trying to achieve like capitalistic ventures through these sort of like movements that they could put money into, like then we fall into the same grips of like what the problem is essentially. So I think it's important to think of it more as a movement of people rather than it just being tied to one particular organization.
Yeah, no, Deidre, you bring up a good point. Landback is also a movement that has been happening for a number, basically since colonization of our lands, right? I think our ancestors and our relatives have been trying to reclaim our lands since they've been taken away from us. So I think it's, yes, Indian Collective has done a lot of work on this, but there are definitely a lot of other individuals and groups and communities that are not very public out there that are working on this and working towards this. And again, it's not just around lands, it's our waters, it's our culture, it's our language, and basically our lifeways, because we were displaced, those things were taken away from us. And so there are many others out there doing this great work.
Thank you very much for this. We have an interesting also question from Brian. Indigenous land rights are a huge issue across the Americas. Have Diné and other Indigenous nations in the US been involved in the discussion with First Nation in Canada and Indigenous people in Mexico, the Amazon, and elsewhere about the way in which each are fighting to maintain or regain the right to use ancestral lands for the traditional purposes? As this conversation, have you heard about this conversation? I don't know, Colleen, for example, or Deidre, do you know of any of this?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what that was about.
Oh, okay. So the question is, Indigenous land rights. Yeah.
Oh, just to say, as someone who studies Latin America, as someone who studies Latin America, this is something that I know a lot more about in the Latin American context, and that some of these issues sound familiar to things that people in the Amazon face, for example. I study Brazil, and I was wondering if these sort of hemispheric conversations have happened between Indigenous nations in, especially the U.S. and Canada, because of a common colonial language, but also with Indigenous nations in Mexico and other places. Exchanging ideas, I guess, or sort of commonalities and differences. I was wondering if that's a conversation that's happened or what that's like.
I think through my perspective as being a filmmaker, filmmaking has been a way to create those communications, those channels as far as what is happening across the hemisphere and southern hemisphere. And I think like when we think about it as borders, as we've been conditioned to think about the geopolitical landscape of North America, Central America, and South America as it being not one of the same as Indigenous people have always resided in these lands since time immemorial. And I think it's important to deconstruct these sort of barriers that are in place by boundaries. And I think these conversations have been happening. We have ancestral trade routes that go throughout the Americas that have been used to trade technology through thousands of years. And I think it's important to always remember that these connections have always been embedded, and that wherever you stand, an Indigenous person has been there before. And I think it's important to realize that you're a guest among these lands, and that these lands, for the most part, have a story to tell. And it's important to listen to Indigenous people because they're the storytellers of these regions. They're speaking from the truth of what has been handed to them from generation to generation.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. There is also a question, reflection from Lydia Jennings. I think I quote her, I read it. I think a question that is always important to assess is, while contemporary science is recognizing Indigenous lands and stewardship practices central to addressing the climate crisis and starting to value it, some communities don't want to form partnership with science organizations because of patterns of harm. It's why relationship building and moving beyond allyship is vital for any scholar moving forward. Yeah, that's a very important discussion. Scholarship is not enough. That's not how you can build a trustful relationship. And if that aspect also interests you, I am doing a presentation with Janine Yassi at the Musée Quai Branly next Wednesday. It's going to be presential, but it's going to be after online. And we are having this dialogue on the ethics of research for anthropologists, but you can also say social scientists in and with Indigenous communities, digging into the topics of protocols of research or refusal of research, and what does it mean and why. So if that's interests you, I encourage you to follow us on that. Also, another question by Jaime Yassi. What future projects are the panelists working on or looking forward to?
I mentioned in my advocacy work that I want to take my advocacy to the next level for the San Juan River, because that's where I do raft guiding and getting more involved with some of our Native youth to expose them and give them access to, and having them reconnect to this place that they call home, that they've probably never been on or have seen. And so there's the San Juan River, well, there's the Waterkeeper Alliance, and they have different waterkeepers all over the US and also in other countries. And I'm working with a nonprofit San Juan Citizens Alliance to try to set that up. So I'm trying to work towards that. And so what I mean by more advocacy work on the San Juan River would be like restoration of native plants possibly, or removal of tamarisk and Russian olive, and getting the communities involved that live along the river, or doing some projects with the Native youth as well. So I'm looking forward to working on that.
Right now, I don't really have a lot of personal projects that I have going on. It's just mostly finishing up different freelance gigs that I've acquired. But as far as the moment goes, it's just finishing up editing.
Good luck with that. We know it, hard work. What about you, Julia and Cody? What are your next projects?
Well, my next projects are actually taking me a little further away from these questions. I wasn't gonna answer because it feels a little unrelated, but I'm back in France and working with a nonprofit on sheep and some kind of, you know, the upcycling, reusing of yeah, kind of an ecological project. I've never thought about it in English. But yeah, basically I'm moving on to some matters in France.
Hi, I lost service for a moment and I got kicked out, I guess. Don't know if anyone noticed, but can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Cool. I found a sweet spot where I can plug in my computer. I am still getting used to my position at AL, but I will be organizing a trails crew that will be working on the Colorado 14ers initiative. So they will be traveling to Colorado this summer and be doing some cool trail work. And then also, hopefully in the future, implementing, like I've said, some infinity groups into ALCC that revolves around queer non-binary folks who want to get their foot in the door of Forest Service work. So creating that space for them would be really dope. Yeah, that's basically what I am working towards with ALCC. Not so much cis hetero dominant crews going out.
All right, thank you very much.